Versailles, 1678. The Sun King, Louis XIV, surveyed his domain. The palace, a testament to his absolute power, stood as a beacon of French grandeur, a symbol carefully constructed to inspire awe and obedience. Every stone, every fountain, spoke of his divine right to rule. The lever, the king's rising, was a meticulously orchestrated performance. Each gesture, each word was laden with significance. To be granted the privilege of assisting Louis with his dressing was to bask, however briefly, in the sun of his favor. Madame de Montespan, the king's mistress, held considerable sway. Her beauty captivated, her wit amused, and her influence permeated every corner of the court. She knew how to use both to her advantage. While the court reveled in extravagance, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Minister of Finance, grappled with the kingdom's mounting debt. He implemented mercantilist policies, fostering trade and industry, but the king's lavish spending threatened to undermine his best efforts. Colbert dared to speak plainly to the king, outlining the fiscal realities that threatened France's prosperity. Louis listened, but the allure of grandeur often outweighed the minister's prudent counsel. Evenings at Versailles were spectacles of unparalleled magnificence. Balls, banquets, and theatrical performances unfolded in a dazzling display of wealth and artistry, reinforcing the king's image as the center of the universe. Louis himself was a skilled dancer, his performance a carefully crafted display of power and grace. Every step was deliberate, every gesture calculated to impress. Madame de Montespan observed the king, her position seemingly secure, yet the ever-shifting currents of court life held no guarantees. Rivals lurked in the shadows, eager to seize any opportunity to usurp her influence. Theatrical performances provided entertainment and served as a subtle form of social commentary. Molière, the king's favorite playwright, dared to satirize the foibles of the aristocracy, offering veiled critiques of power and privilege. In the midst of the court's extravagance, Françoise d'Aubigné, the children's governess, remained a figure of quiet dignity. Her intelligence and piety gradually drew the king's attention, offering a stark contrast to the flamboyant Madame de Montespan. The king found solace in Madame de Maintenon's company. Her wisdom and unwavering faith offered a different perspective, a path towards introspection and moral rectitude. Beneath the glittering surface of Versailles, tensions simmered. The seeds of future conflicts were sown in the fertile ground of ambition, betrayal, and discontent. The Sun King's reign, at its zenith, was about to cast a long, ominous shadow. Versailles, 1679. Whispers, like insidious drafts, began to circulate within the gilded cage of Versailles. The king, though seemingly impervious, could not entirely ignore the rumors that now tainted the air he breathed. Madame de Montespan, once the undisputed queen of the court, found herself increasingly isolated. Her influence, once absolute, began to wane as whispers of l'affaire des poisons reached the king's ears. Colbert, ever the pragmatist, grappled with the kingdom's finances. The king's extravagant building projects and incessant wars threatened to bankrupt France, and the finance minister felt the weight of the nation on his shoulders. The affair of the poisons, a scandal involving accusations of witchcraft and murder amongst the highest echelons of French society, cast a long shadow over the court. The king, initially dismissive, could no longer ignore the growing evidence. Accusations against Madame de Montespan mounted. She was accused of consulting with La Voisin, a fortune-teller and abortionist, and even of attempting to use black magic to secure the king's affections. Colbert, ever loyal to the crown, found himself caught between his duty to the king and his concern for the welfare of France. He dared to suggest curtailing the king's extravagant spending, a suggestion that was met with icy displeasure. Amidst the chaos and scandal, the Marquise de Maintenon remained a figure of quiet dignity and piety. As governess to the king's illegitimate children, she exerted a subtle but growing influence over Louis XIV. The king, troubled by the scandals within his court, began to seek solace in religion. He attended Mass more frequently and engaged in lengthy discussions with religious advisors. The atmosphere at court became increasingly tense. Courtiers, fearing implication in the scandals, carefully guarded their words and actions. Trust was a rare commodity. The strain of managing the kingdom's finances took its toll on Colbert's health. He suffered a series of debilitating illnesses, his strength failing with each passing day. The king, once so confident and assured, began to show signs of vulnerability. The scandals and the growing financial crisis had shaken his belief in his own absolute power. As Madame de Montespan's influence waned, the Marquise de Maintenon's star began to rise. Her quiet wisdom and unwavering faith offered the king a refuge from the turmoil of the court, and he increasingly sought her guidance. Versailles, 1680. Françoise d'Aubigné, the future Marquise de Maintenon, began her days as governess to Louis XIV's illegitimate children. It was a role that placed her at the fringes of the court, yet close enough to observe its intricate dance of power. The king, weary from the endless demands of court, found a certain peace in watching his children. He noticed Françoise's patient demeanor and her genuine care for their well-being. Françoise instilled in the children a sense of piety and discipline, qualities that were often absent in the extravagant world of Versailles. Her dedication did not go unnoticed by the king. Soon, Louis sought Françoise's counsel not just on matters concerning his children, but on broader questions of morality and governance. He found her to be intelligent, discreet, and refreshingly honest. Madame de Montespan, once the undisputed queen of Louis's heart, watched Françoise's ascent with growing alarm. The king's increasing attention to the governess was a clear threat to her own position. In a private confrontation, Montespan attempted to intimidate Françoise, reminding her of her place. But Françoise, fortified by her faith and her growing influence with the king, stood her ground. Meanwhile, Jean-Baptiste Colbert grappled with the kingdom's finances. The extravagant spending at Versailles, fueled by Louis's ambition and Montespan's lavish tastes, had left France deeply in debt. Colbert, with a heavy heart, proposed new taxes to the king. He knew it would be an unpopular measure, but he saw no other way to avert financial ruin. The king listened, his expression unreadable. The king was torn. He understood the necessity of Colbert's plan, but he also feared the potential for unrest. He sought solace in prayer, questioning the burdens of his crown. Françoise, aware of the king's turmoil, gently steered him towards a path of compassion. She reminded him of his duty to his subjects, urging him to temper justice with mercy. Montespan, desperate to regain her influence, rallied her allies, determined to discredit Françoise and reclaim her place at the king's side. The court buzzed with intrigue and whispers of betrayal. As the sun set over Versailles, Louis XIV stood at a crossroads. The kingdom teetered on the brink of financial crisis. His mistress plotted against his confidant, and the seeds of discontent were being sown among his people. The Sun King's shadow was growing longer, casting a pall over the gilded cage of his reign. The air in the throne room was thick with unspoken anxieties. The affair of the poisons, a dark stain on the court, threatened to engulf even the most powerful. Madame de Montespan, once the undisputed Queen of Versailles, found her influence waning. The rumors surrounding her involvement in dark practices grew louder, chipping away at her gilded facade. Colbert, ever the pragmatist, saw opportunity amidst the chaos. He doubled his efforts to bolster France's economy, pushing for mercantilist policies that would fill the royal coffers, regardless of the court's distractions. The Marquise de Maintenon, governess to the royal children, began to exert a quiet influence. Her focus on piety and education offered a stark contrast to the court's excesses, slowly gaining her favor with the king. Louis XIV, growing increasingly concerned about the financial strain on the kingdom, sought Colbert's counsel. The endless wars and lavish spending threatened to undo all the progress made. Desperate to regain her position, Madame de Montespan attempted to sway the king with passionate appeals, denying any involvement in the scandalous affair. Colbert tirelessly worked to establish new trade routes and protect French industries, believing that economic prosperity was the key to the kingdom's strength. Maintenon's influence extended beyond mere academics. She instilled in the royal children a sense of religious devotion and moral rectitude, qualities sorely lacking in the court. Louis XIV, observing Maintenon's dedication, began to see her as more than just a governess. He admired her intelligence, her piety, and her genuine concern for his children's well-being. The isolation began to consume Madame de Montespan. Her once vibrant court had thinned, replaced by whispers and averted glances. She was a queen without a kingdom. Colbert presented a stark reality to the king. The kingdom teetered on the brink of financial ruin despite his best efforts. Austerity measures were necessary, but the court was resistant to change. As the shadows deepened over Versailles, Louis XIV found solace in Maintenon's quiet strength and unwavering faith. Her influence grew with each passing day, subtly reshaping the court in her image. The seeds of a new era were being sown, an era of piety and restraint, but also of potential unrest. The weight of the kingdom pressed heavily on Louis. The affair of the poisons had shaken him, revealing a darkness he hadn't believed possible within his own court. He found himself increasingly drawn to the quiet counsel of Françoise d'Aubigné. Françoise, ever discreet, offered wisdom rooted in piety and reason. She spoke of duty, morality, and the importance of divine grace, concepts that resonated deeply with the king's growing unease. Madame de Montespan, once the undisputed Queen of Versailles, watched with growing resentment. The king's affections, and therefore his ear, were slipping away. The governess, with her quiet piety, posed a far greater threat than any rival before. The king found solace in prayer, guided by Madame de Maintenon's unwavering faith. He sought redemption from the scandals that had plagued his court, a desire fueled by genuine remorse and a pragmatic understanding of the political ramifications. Meanwhile, Colbert wrestled with the kingdom's finances. The extravagance of Versailles, coupled with the cost of war, had created a staggering debt. His attempts at reform were met with fierce resistance from powerful nobles who benefited from the existing system of tax exemptions and privileges. "These reforms will cripple us," the Duc de Sully thundered, his face red with indignation. "We will not stand idly by while you dismantle the foundations of our prosperity." Colbert, weary but resolute, stood his ground, knowing that the future of France depended on his success. "You think you can replace me?" Madame de Montespan hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You are nothing but a governess, a mere shadow in the king's life." Madame de Maintenon met her gaze unflinchingly. "My concern is for the king's soul, madame," she replied calmly. "A concern you seem to have abandoned long ago." The court, despite its underlying tensions, continued to indulge in lavish entertainment. Molière's Tartuffe, a biting satire of religious hypocrisy, was performed to great acclaim, showcasing the king's continued patronage of the arts. Colbert laid bare the grim reality of the nation's finances. The king listened, his expression growing increasingly grave. The weight of responsibility settled heavily upon him. In his distress, Louis turned once more to Madame de Maintenon. She offered not empty platitudes, but a path towards spiritual renewal, a promise of solace in a world of shifting allegiances and financial woes. Madame de Montespan, her power waning, found herself increasingly isolated. The glittering facade of Versailles concealed a growing emptiness within her heart. As the sun set over Versailles, casting long shadows across the manicured gardens, Louis walked with Madame de Maintenon, seeking guidance and solace. The king's confidant had become his beacon in the gathering darkness, and the course of the French monarchy was about to change forever. The weight of the crown settled heavily on Louis XIV. The affair of the poisons had left a lingering unease, a crack in the facade of absolute power. Doubts, like unwelcome guests, crept into his mind, questioning the moral cost of his reign. Madame de Montespan felt her grip on the king loosen. Whispers followed her like a persistent shadow, reminders of her alleged involvement in dark practices. The court, once her playground, now felt like a treacherous stage. Françoise de Maintenon, with her quiet piety and unwavering faith, offered solace to the king's troubled soul. She spoke of repentance, of humility, and of a higher power than earthly kings. Colbert, ever the pragmatist, presented the grim realities of the kingdom's finances. The endless wars and lavish expenditures threatened to bankrupt France, he warned, his voice grave and unwavering. Torn between the allure of power and the whispers of conscience, Louis XIV wrestled with his decisions. The grandeur of Versailles seemed a hollow victory if built upon moral compromise. The rivalry between Madame de Montespan and Madame de Maintenon intensified. Athénée saw Françoise as a threat, a pious interloper stealing the king's affections and influence. Françoise found strength and guidance in her faith. She prayed for the king, for France, and for the strength to navigate the treacherous currents of the court. Colbert tirelessly worked to salvage the kingdom's finances. He implemented new taxes, promoted trade, and desperately sought ways to curb the king's extravagant spending. Louis XIV found himself increasingly drawn to Françoise's counsel. Her words resonated with a truth he had long ignored, a yearning for something beyond the fleeting pleasures of court. The court, ever fickle, began to distance itself from Madame de Montespan. Her star was fading, and the ambitious courtiers sought favor elsewhere. The king found solace in the scriptures, guided by Françoise's gentle hand. The words of the prophets spoke to his growing sense of unease, a call to repentance and reform. The strain of managing the kingdom's finances took its toll on Colbert. His health failing, he knew that the future of France hung precariously in the balance, threatened by war and extravagance. Versailles, 1683. The glory days of Louis XIV's reign were beginning to fade. The affair of the poisons had cast a long shadow, and the costs of his wars strained the kingdom's coffers. Françoise Athénée, once the undisputed queen of the court, found her influence waning. The king, increasingly drawn to piety, could no longer ignore the rumors and accusations that swirled around her. With a heavy heart, Louis formally dismissed Madame de Montespan from her position as his mistress. It was a painful decision, but one he felt was necessary for the sake of his soul and the stability of the court. The fall from grace was swift and brutal. Madame de Montespan, once the envy of all, was now a figure of pity and scorn. Her reign had come to an end. As Madame de Montespan's star faded, another rose in its place. Françoise d'Aubigné, now the Marquise de Maintenon, continued to exert her influence over the king, guiding him towards a path of piety and repentance. Following the death of Queen Maria Theresa, Louis XIV found solace and guidance in Madame de Maintenon's company. Their bond deepened, their conversations filled with matters of faith and state. In a clandestine ceremony, far from the prying eyes of the court, Louis XIV secretly married Madame de Maintenon, a union of souls, bound by faith and a shared vision for the future of France. Meanwhile, Jean-Baptiste Colbert faced an uphill battle to manage the kingdom's finances. The king's costly wars and extravagant lifestyle had drained the treasury. Colbert's attempts to rein in spending were met with resistance from the king, who refused to compromise on his vision of French grandeur. Desperate to find new sources of revenue, Colbert resorted to increasingly unpopular measures, further alienating the French people. Madame de Maintenon, now the king's confidant and secret wife, wielded considerable influence behind the scenes. She used her position to advocate for religious reforms and social justice, but her actions also sparked resentment among those who felt excluded from power. The Sun King's reign, once so radiant, was beginning to cast a longer, darker shadow. The seeds of discontent were sown, and the future of France hung in the balance. The year is 1688. Europe teeters on the brink of war as alliances shift and ambitions clash. Louis XIV, driven by a desire for territorial expansion and strategic dominance, finds France increasingly embroiled in costly conflicts. The League of Augsburg forms against France, setting the stage for a prolonged and draining war. Colbert, ever the pragmatist, struggles to manage the kingdom's finances. The war effort demands vast sums of money, straining the treasury and forcing him to implement unpopular taxes. His warnings about the long-term consequences of unchecked spending are often met with resistance from a king focused on military glory. Madame de Montespan's influence wanes as the king's attention shifts. The opulent lifestyle she once enjoyed is threatened by the kingdom's financial woes and the rise of new figures at court. She watches, increasingly isolated as the world around her changes. Françoise d'Aubigné, now the Marquise de Maintenon, dedicates herself to charitable works and religious education. She establishes the Maison Royale de Saint-Louis at Saint-Cyr, a school for girls from impoverished noble families, providing them with a structured education and a path to a better life. In the countryside, the common people bear the brunt of the war's financial burden. Heavy taxes and conscription decimate families and leave many struggling to survive. Discontent simmers beneath the surface, fueled by poverty and resentment towards the extravagant court at Versailles. The king increasingly seeks solace and guidance from Madame de Maintenon. Her influence over him grows as she encourages him to adopt a more pious and introspective lifestyle. He begins to question the morality of his past actions and the extravagance of his court. Colbert continues to work tirelessly to stabilize the French economy, But the war's demands prove overwhelming. He becomes increasingly frustrated by the king's refusal to curb spending and his reliance on short-term solutions. Madame de Montespan's beauty begins to fade, mirroring the decline of her power. She realizes that her reign as the king's favorite is coming to an end, and she struggles to accept her diminished status. The war drags on, claiming countless lives and draining France's resources. Victories are hard-won and Pyrrhic, offering little real gain in exchange for the immense cost. The morale of the French troops begins to decline. Madame de Maintenon witnesses firsthand the suffering caused by the war. Her compassion for the victims deepens her resolve to promote peace and social justice. She uses her influence to advocate for the welfare of the common people. The king's conscience is troubled by the war's devastation and the suffering of his people. He begins to question his own motivations and the true meaning of his reign. He seeks solace in religion and the guidance of Madame de Maintenon. The Sun King's shadow lengthens as France faces increasing challenges. The seeds of future discontent are sown, and the foundations of absolute monarchy begin to tremble. The age of unquestioned power is drawing to a close. Versailles, 1688. The weight of the crown and the specter of mortality settled upon Louis XIV. The flamboyant displays of his earlier reign gave way to a growing sense of piety, fueled by the quiet influence of Madame de Maintenon. Frances de Maintenon, ever discreet and observant, guided the king towards a more devout path. Her influence was subtle, a gentle redirection rather than a forceful command. The shift in the king's affections was a harsh blow to Madame de Montespan. Her reign as the acknowledged mistress was over, replaced by the quiet power of piety. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the steadfast architect of France's economic might, watched with growing concern as the king's priorities shifted from fiscal responsibility to religious devotion. The court of Versailles underwent a transformation. Extravagant balls were replaced with solemn religious ceremonies. Shows of piety became the new path to royal favor. Madame de Maintenon channeled her influence into charitable works and the establishment of the Royal House of St. Louis at Saint-Cyr, a school for young women of noble birth but limited means. The strain of managing the kingdom's finances and witnessing the shift in royal priorities took its toll on Colbert's health. Louis XIV visited Colbert in his final hours, acknowledging the minister's unwavering loyalty and invaluable service to the crown. With his last breath, Colbert warned the king of the dangers of excessive spending and the importance of maintaining a strong economy. Colbert's death marked the end of an era. His pragmatic approach to governance was sorely missed in the years that followed. The influence of Madame de Maintenon continued to grow, shaping the king's moral compass and guiding the court towards a more austere path. The Sun King, once the epitome of flamboyant power, now stood at a crossroads, his reign marked by both unparalleled grandeur and the looming shadows of future challenges. The seeds of change had been sown, and the kingdom held its breath, awaiting the harvest. Versailles, 1689. The weight of France rested heavily upon Louis XIV. The extravagance of his court, once a symbol of national pride, now felt like a gilded cage, isolating him from the realities faced by his people. Colbert, though long dead, his legacy haunted the royal coffers. The Sun King's ambitions had drained the treasury, and his successors struggled to manage the debt, sowing the seeds of future financial ruin. Madame de Maintenon, her influence over the king unwavering, guided him towards piety and austerity. Yet, even her good intentions could not fully bridge the chasm between the court's opulence and the nation's suffering. The Hall of Mirrors, once a symbol of France's glory, now seemed to reflect the king's own doubts. He saw not a triumphant ruler, but a man burdened by the weight of his decisions. Far from the gilded halls of Versailles, the common people of France struggled to survive. Famine and heavy taxation fueled their resentment towards the monarchy, a resentment that simmered beneath the surface. Madame de Montespan, her reign as the king's mistress long over, watched from the sidelines as Madame de Maintenon consolidated her power. The sting of lost influence was a constant reminder of the fleeting nature of favor at court. In the shadows of Paris, whispers of revolution grew louder. Discontented intellectuals and disgruntled commoners alike dreamt of a France free from the tyranny of absolute rule. The seeds of rebellion had been sown. The king, despite his age, remained preoccupied with matters of war. The constant conflicts drained the nation's resources and further strained the already fragile economy. Madame de Maintenon, ever the voice of reason, urged the king to consider the plight of his people, but her influence could only stretch so far against the ingrained habits of absolute power. The heavy hand of taxation continued to crush the peasantry. Unscrupulous tax collectors, acting with impunity, exacerbated the people's misery and fueled their animosity towards the ruling class. As the sun set over Versailles, Louis XIV contemplated his legacy. He had built a magnificent kingdom, but at what cost? The seeds of discontent had been sown, and the future of France remained uncertain. The wind carried the whispers of change through the streets of Paris. The Bourbon dynasty, once seemingly invincible, now faced a gathering storm. The seeds of revolution had taken root, and the harvest was yet to come.